Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel. My name is Marwa Daoudy. I'm an associate professor at Georgetown University. I had the privilege to edit and contribute to a collection of articles with the Carnegie Middle East Center, where I was formerly a non-resident scholar, on the title of Troubled Waters in Conflict and a Changing Climate, Transboundary Basins Across the MENA Region. The importance of water increases substantially in arid and semi-arid regions such as the Middle East and North Africa. And we know the region is home to key transboundary water basins. To address these issues, this collection gathers some of the leading researchers from the region and on the region, researchers, analysts, and practitioners who were invited to contribute their analysis to the interactions between different states and non-state actors over several key transboundary waters, including the cases of Iraq, Lebanon, Oman, Palestine, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Each of those 10 chapters highlight the relevant interstate relations over a shared basin or aquifer, but also outline the domestic interactions over water and environmental issues. This collection is also showing that an exclusive focus on climate change obfuscates important empirical drivers of human insecurity, water and food insecurity, including governmental policies, but as well as repressive systems, as well as occupying powers and hegemonic neighboring riparian states, situations of occupation and military conflict. This compendium was also published, and this panel is gathering those experts in the context of the upcoming World Water Day, which will be celebrated this coming Friday, around the theme, paradoxically, of water for peace. The other very striking element in our context, also regional context, is the ongoing tragedy that is happening in Gaza as we speak, a devastating war that has led to the genocide of civilians, as well as very devastating impacts on the environment, which we can refer to as an ecocide as we speak, as we write, happening, as we continue to see what is unfolding in Gaza itself. To do that, to discuss troubled waters in the conflict, in the context of conflict, in those specific cases, I have the great pleasure today to gather very distinguished analysts, panelists, writers, who have written extensively on these issues and have specifically contributed to that compendium, who will be presenting on their paper, but also providing updates in relation to the situation. I'll start by alphabetical order. Mohammad Al-Saidi, welcome, is a research associate professor at the Center for Sustainable Development at Qatar University, and Mohammad will be speaking on Yemen. Elia J. Ayoub is a researcher and writer from Lebanon with a PhD in cultural analysis from the University of Zurich, and Elia will be discussing his paper on Lebanon. Fuad Bateh is a consultant with a variety of organizations and institutions working in development, law, and negotiations related to the environment and natural resources, together with his co-author, Rebhi Al-Sheikh. They both contributed on Gaza. Rebhi Al-Sheikh, unfortunately, is not able to be with us today. He started working on this paper in Gaza while in Gaza, and since then, he has been forcibly displaced out of Gaza with all members of his family. And Muna Dajani is an action researcher with a background in critical political ecology, and Muna will be discussing the situation of the Golan as well as the West Bank. And I will end the presentations on the peace process relating to water issues in the West Bank. We will start now with Elia, who will start the discussion on Lebanon. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Marwa. So I will briefly mention the chapter I wrote about, which was on the Basri Valley in Lebanon. There was a campaign to stop a proposed project by the government called the Dam Project, the Basri Dam Project. Informally, the government called it the Water Supply Augmentation Project. In the context of what's happening right now in Gaza, and to a lesser but pretty serious extent as well in southern Lebanon, the Basri story doesn't seem to be as big. And indeed, I wouldn't argue that it is. But what it does elucidate, or at least what it does illustrate, I would say, is the deep connection between anything ecological, anything eco, you might say, in the region and the politics of it all. And as you mentioned, there tends to be in a lot of discussions, a lot of discourse, a overemphasis on global warming, not to de-emphasize the severity of global warming, obviously, but global warming happens in a context, and different places can react to it in different ways. There are adaptive mechanisms, there are maladaptive mechanisms, there are differences between how an authoritarian government might respond versus a a democratic one, or the local and the regional, and so on and so forth. The impacts are not the same. Right now, the situation in Lebanon is dire. Again, I would never compare it to Gaza or, for that matter, Yemen. But it's dire. It's been dire for quite some time now. And the story of Bisri is ironically one of the few positive ones that we saw in the past few years. And it was made a bit more prescient because the announcement of the cancellation of the dam project, which came when the World Bank announced that they would no longer fund the Lebanese government because they didn't meet a certain number of criteria. The news came about a month after the explosion at the port of Beirut in 2020. It came in September. The explosion was in August. So understandably, virtually no one really focused on the good news. It took some time for it to kind of trickle down, we might say. But it is still good news. And it linked the campaign, the Save Bisri Valley campaign, linked very heavily with the October uprising that had happened in 2019 in Lebanon, which we often refer to as a revolution in Lebanon, Thawra. Because the campaigners had understood very deeply, I think, that there was an opportunity there to link what they saw as an unfolding ecological crisis with the existing and, unfortunately, to this day, ongoing political crisis. That the two could just not be dissociated, and dissociating them would be actually a political decision. It's not an apolitical thing. It would be a political decision to not look at the wider structural problems. As I mentioned, Lebanon right now is also undergoing a different type of crisis, which is related to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The conflict between Hezbollah and Israel is of a different nature as the one between Hamas and Israel. But concretely, in especially southern Lebanon, there's been a pretty intense onslaught of what we could call ecocide, and I think many scholars have already called it ecocide as well in the context of southern Lebanon. Against, like, I don't even have numbers on me, but as of November, it was already hundreds of hectares and tens of thousands of trees burnt, often with white phosphorus, aquifers polluted, entire villages either partially destroyed or, at the very least, people forcibly displaced, including a lot of very close friends of mine and their families. And this seems to be, well, we know this because it's the Israeli officials mentioned it out loud that it's part of a campaign to create a so-called buffer zone in southern Lebanon. And one creates a buffer zone by effectively creating what I would call, I mean, what others have also called a death zone, by making it unsuitable for human life. And you do that, of course, by attacking the land, by attacking the resources that people depend on. The olive trees in southern Lebanon are known, at least in the region, at least in Lebanon. And it's harvest season, and a lot of them are more, again, I do not have the exact numbers as of today because it changes very quickly every day, but it was bad in November, and it's gotten worse since, obviously. Farmers are not able to harvest. It's just not safe. So you have a significant percentage of the national output, if you want, on a yearly basis that has been wasted. And this, of course, comes at a cost: economic cost, environmental cost, health cost, with white phosphorus, as I mentioned. Pollution of the aquifers come at a very serious health cost, as we can, of course, imagine, and so on and so forth. And so in that context, the story of Bisri being a small, I think small, it's pretty big, but in the context of the wider crisis that we are talking about here and that we talked about in the compendium, it's like one of those small but significant victories, because it shows that with some mobilization and focused mobilization, especially, which is what happened in the case of the Save Bisri Valley campaign, and one which, as I mentioned earlier, understood that they had to link with the wider contestation, uprising, revolution, whatever we want to call it, against the sectarian system and against the government, against the regime, as we would call it, in Lebanon. They understood that doing so is important for both strategic reasons, but also moral reasons. And then not doing so would actually also be, again, strategically irrational, a bad strategic mistake, but also immoral, as they perceived it. So this is I guess, a broad overview of, as I mentioned, the chapter is very specifically on the Save Bisri Valley. I wanted to be very detailed, and it preceded the ongoing crisis and genocide in Gaza and in the ecocide in southern Lebanon. But I hope people find it interesting. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elia. You showed us the interplay between environmental concerns, but also sociopolitical movements and also grassroots activism and resistance, but also in the context of all of the geopolitics, the regional impact of aggression and war, and the targeting of land in South Lebanon is part of that whole discussion as well. Thank you for that. I'll move on now to Mohammad, who will talk about Yemen, moving on to conflict, now more the conflict aspect of our discussion. Please, Mohammad.
Yeah, thank you, Marwa, for the compodium and the invitation to be here. My chapter is titled Yemen's Water Wars, Why Climate Change is a Drop in the Bucket. I argue in this chapter that the water problems or the water crisis in Yemen did not begin with the conflict. It was aggravated by the conflict, but it had its roots in the post-independence era in Yemen, where we had this new state in Yemen subsidizing agriculture, promoting irrigation, and basically laying the roads for environmental degradation and water problem that we have now. So with, for example, subsidies for diesel prices and also the policies for agriculture development, we had increase of irrigated agriculture in Yemen actually from 1970 to 2004. Irrigated agriculture increased by 1,800%. Rain-fed agriculture, also traditional farming using spade irrigation in Yemen, decreased. Of course, irrigated agriculture needs more upfront investments, and this led to widening the gap between, let's say, wealthy agricultural water users and using irrigation and others, and traditional farming. And with this, the growth, of course, of khat, one of the major non-food crops in Yemen. It's a wild stimulant that is used in Yemen widely. And here, this is basically the background of the current crisis. In this chapter, I talked about how the current war has aggravated this crisis. So we have, of course, destruction of infrastructure. We have also blockades of major cities such as Taiz that have been suffering for many decades, actually, from water problems. We have the increase of solar energy use for irrigation by, again, these wealthy farmers that are mainly producing khat. Khat production in Yemen have increased during the war. Yemen already had a huge problem with water supply coverage. So 60% of the Yemenis before the war had access to water, and only 20% access to improved sanitation services. Of course, the situation is much worse. And we have, of course, climate change. And in Yemen, actually, nobody knows exactly what are the impacts, the regional or sub-regional impacts of climate change, but it will certainly lead to decreased yields in rain-fed agriculture. We already have some extreme floods in 2020. So in this chapter, I argue that we should go back to the phases of water reforms that we had in Yemen. I'll explain the water reforms that we had in the 90s and the early 2000s, and suggest some pathways to update these reforms and to build on them. Basically, to strengthen water institutions, to confront agriculture use and improve efficiency in agriculture and other solutions. These are costly investments, but Yemen is in dire need for water cooperation, for aid, for water aid, for a restart of the water reform process to put Yemen back on the track towards water sustainability. A major problem for Yemen with a hugely increasing population living under a stagnation of war.
Thank you very much, Mohammad, for outlining the sustainability failures since the post-independence period, but also how all of these vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by the ongoing conflict since 2015. And also the man-made famine and the rise of cholera that we've seen in Yemen has been a very striking feature of that devastating impact of the war on Yemen. Now we'll move on to a very striking and devastating example in the news that Fuad, please, on Gaza, the situation of water resources and depletion and environmental insecurity and the ecocide that is happening as we speak.
Well, thank you very much, Marwa. It's a pleasure to be with you today and also the other panelists. I'm sorry that our lead author, engineer Elia J, couldn't be with us. In fact, he's really the leading authority, having been the deputy head of the Palestinian Water Authority for many years with the chief responsibility for Gaza. And even after 2014, after the devastating war that impacted Gaza then, he was part of the government's reconstruction team from the water and sanitation sector side, and eventually becoming the head of the overall reconstruction program. He is, as you mentioned, and fortunately, he and his family are out of harm's way at the moment, but they are displaced, and so he couldn't be with us today. The title of our paper chapter that was a part of the contribution was Gaza Strip's Coastal Aquifer under Occupation and Climate Change. And what we did in the paper initially was kind of frame the historical background to Gaza, talking about that Gaza was an area almost 3 times its size as a district in pre-1948 Palestine. And at that time, it had a population of roughly around 151,000, with very good, known actually for its very high quality of water. With the conflict, basically almost 200 villages in the surrounding area were compelled into the confines, which is Gaza now, and that added about an additional 175,000 people. When you take that and think about that population and its growth over time, we've now reached to current day 2.2 to 2.3 million people living in 365 square kilometers, making it one of the most, if not the most densely populated places on Earth. We then went on to talk about the deteriorating water resources, because underneath Gaza lies the coastal aquifer, which is primarily shared with Israel to the north, and parts of it run underneath the Sinai, so Egypt to the south. And this has been the main source of water for that large population. And in fact, the pressure of that population in such a small area, an area that is actually smaller than many municipalities, large municipalities in United States or Europe, for instance, we would never in those places expect a population of that size to actually depend only on endogenous resources or local water. We would often see all manner of facilities to bring water imported into that, but that's can't be the case in the political context in Gaza. In fact, my background is in law, and of course, also it's governance and policy. And from a legal perspective, when we talk about transboundary water, we talk about it being equitably and reasonably shared. And if we look at the amounts of volumes that are being pumped out of the aquifer in unsustainable manners among the parties, the overwhelming or lion's share is being pumped by Israel to the north. Gaza, if it were pumping the adequate amount of water, or in the past, because the pumping now isn't really happening, we would say the sustainable yield of the aquifer under Gaza is about 55 million cubic meters. But we actually know that because of the demand far exceeds the supply, they have been over pumping the aquifer for now decades. And it was identified even in the 90s by USAID and other development agencies who were looking for solutions at that time. The problem there is that over pumping of the aquifer creates all sorts of problems with salinity coming in from the sea, so increased salinity, and then the hyper agricultural activity that's needed to create food security for that population means a lot of pesticides and chemical uses, nitrates, etc., that have gone into the aquifer. So we have said, and it has been reported, that the water quality in Gaza has not met WHO standards for drinking water for a long time now, but that percentage has increased. And before the current war, we would say it was at 97%. That additional percentage really reflecting the water that was being purchased and brought in from Israel, with some limited desalination inside Gaza. Now, we went on in the paper to talk about avoiding the human catastrophe in Gaza and opportunities and setbacks, where we talked about opportunities of renewable energy. We talked about problems, though, with land use and the increasing restriction on land use with the perimeter fence and spaces that were no-go areas. And then we also focused primarily on the closure regime. It's basically a place under siege with a blockade, both from land and sea. And that has led to all sorts of manifestation of everything from application of dual use restrictions on all manner of goods that we would consider normal daily use, which doesn't allow development to happen functionally. So we then went into the conclusion of our paper and basically sketched, the current context, which we estimated at that time. If we look at the scale of harm that's been done in the recent conflict and compare it to 2014, where Gaza Reconstruction Pledging Conference basically mobilized $5 billion, about 70% applied to reconstruction, about 30% for budget supplements. When we wrote this paper, we estimated conservatively that we would need 20 times that now. As of mid-February, with the basic ongoing assessments, we now conservatively estimate, or RIPHE does, at about 35 times the costs of reconstruction compared to the 2014 period. And in fact, there's a lot that's not included with that. But when you look at that financial envelope, we're talking over 100 billion, closer to 120 billion. And you actually think to yourself, all of Palestine's GDP in 2022 was close to 20 billion, 19 billion. So we're looking at a future that's going to need in excess of 100 billion at least. And the question will be difficult because many donors will not want to make those investments of the threat of security and the political constraints. I know I've gone well over my time. I apologize, but it's a lot to put out there. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Fuad. Your paper with RIPHE also managed to show the amount of the restrictions in the decades that preceded the last 5 months, and how the devastating impacts since the last 5 months have added to the tragedy and the lack of access to water, the seeping of sewage water in the streets, the destruction of the infrastructure. We can discuss all of that in our Q&A also discussion later on. And our thoughts are with RIPHE and his family as we speak. We move on to another aspect also of occupation, land occupation, resource capture, which is Muna, the occupied Golan, and you also want to talk about the occupied West Bank. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marwa, and thank you to excellent colleagues and panelists. And I wanted to, within kind of the ongoing genocide and its different forms, including ecocide, I just wanted to keep in mind that water is definitely has been inflicted tremendously in that, and our relation with water has been completely transformed and maimed. And I would like to maybe speak about that later. My chapter in this compendium had really focused on water injustice and kind of looking at perspectives from the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, but kind of to follow up on all of the speakers have mentioned, kind of transboundary river basins end up, inflicting different relationalities with water across the communities that people live in. So transboundary water, while they are really usually in the governance sector, has been confined to states and state-centric actors and government officials. It also has, at the end of the day, implications on people's relation with the environment and people's relations with water. So my chapter has kind of started with kind of highlighting the limitation of existing mainstream transboundary governance framings and global mechanisms, and wanted to pay attention to what happens when transboundary waters have been when they are in the local context, when these waters end up being taken away from communities to different policies making structures, and especially in a context like the Jordan River Basin, where we have one of those riparian countries is an occupying power, and it's an occupying power that also has settler colonial intentionality and a settler colonial project. So how can we think of these governing mechanisms under these conditions? And I wanted to also highlight how there is also increasing interest in the colonial legacy of transboundary water governance in particular, but also resource management all across our region, especially paying particular attention to how this type of colonial thinking about our relations with water end up also being reproduced by nation states with kind of devastating implications on sustainable resource governance. So within those ideas and this framework, we also saw that transboundary water management arrangements end up focusing on building infrastructure, the idea of territorial sovereignty of each of these nation states, and kind of thinking that the infrastructure becomes at the end not a means but the end itself in terms of the arrangements that have been reached on the Jordan River Basin. So there is a lot of also focus on what infrastructure to build, and these infrastructure usually are very state-centric, are very large scale, and then they don't come to actually fulfill the interests and needs of the local communities. Particularly, we have found also in the research that transboundary arrangements on river basins like the Jordan River Basin end up actually impeding transformational change. And they end up also not really fulfilling the role of reaching equitable sharing of these resources. But to even further complicate it, what happens to communities that have been living under military occupation? What about these communities that don't even have any fulfillment of their water rights? On the contrary, their whole existence is now also being under threat, like we see Palestinians in Gaza, but also Palestinians throughout the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and even Palestinians inside 48. And of course, the occupied Syrian Golan Heights in particular, which was the focus of this chapter, because again, we have these cases of forgotten occupations and these cases of communities that have been left behind, that have been totally disconnected from their homeland, Syria, and also being forced to live since 1967 and consequently in 1982 under Israeli illegal annexation, meaning that they have been included in the Israeli water system, but their only relations with water is that of Israel's exploitation of their water resources. We know that the occupied Golan Heights really is a very important geostrategic and an important site at the heart of the basin, with the highest levels of elevation and the highest level of rainfall and snowfall. So it is a very strategic location, but we see that communities that have been living in those areas are struggling the most to access their land and to access their water resources. So the focus has been on these communities and how under these governance mechanisms, we tend to forget also that governance, the Transboundary River Basin are made up of communities, and these communities have very differentiated and variable relations with water, and they also live under conditions of resource extraction and resource exploitation by this occupying power. So what happens? How do these communities actually attempt to reclaim rights to water is another important thing, because communities all over the Jordan River Basin, whether in the Arab states like Lebanon, Syria, but particularly Jordan, or in the occupied lands in Syria and Palestine, end up finding ways to reclaim rights to water, and end up also finding mechanisms through which to re-establish connections to the land and connection to their resources. And the case of the Syrian occupied Golan Heights is really particularly interesting, because they did manage to confront that settler colonial logic of resource capture, especially on water, and and managed to reclaim their rights to water by building what I term as counter infrastructure. And this counter infrastructure in itself kind of also pushing us to think beyond water specifically, and to think about, relations between land and water, because they're all connected. And to connect also, finally, to conclude as to kind of what can we learn, in the scholarship we produce about transboundary water governance. What can we learn from kind of investigating and problematizing water, to go beyond the actual resource, but also to relations between water, food, and land issues, and even also energy, green energy production, which I'm happy to speak about later, because I'm sure I went over time.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Muna. I think it's very interesting, your concept of counter-infrastructure strategies on the part of the dominated, occupied communities in resistance to occupation, to hegemony. You also show in your paper how Israel is also promoting renewable energies in the occupied territories, in the Golan, in the name of green development. And we've referred to that as greenwashing a lot in the literature, and we can discuss that later. So now I'll move on to another aspect of resource capture, colonial practices through peace negotiations. And my paper was titled Institutionalizing Hegemony Through Peace Negotiations, Water in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. And I show in my paper actually how Israel has weaponized Palestinian access to the shared mountain aquifer, as well as wastewater treatment, and used the two issues as a bargaining chip in the peace negotiations that had started since the Oslo Accord, the Oslo negotiations, and the Oslo II agreement. It's interesting to note as well that the conflict over land in Palestine has often been framed in water imaginaries. And it would go back to the early days of Zionism and Zionist thought, with Theodor Herzl's early writings, to Chaim Weissman's asking, actually framing it as how Palestine's economy will depend on water supply. And as well, this has been really in the Zionist imaginary. On the Palestinian side, of course, it's an integral part of their property and territorial rights. And that has been the ongoing tension also through the peace negotiations. I want to show that mainly what is at stake here is the shared mountain aquifer basin, which is the main groundwater in the occupied West Bank. And it's divided in different sub-basins. But interestingly here, when Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, it expanded the domination over historic Palestine, but also took control of the recharge areas of the West Bank's western and northeastern aquifers. And this is a very important strategic asset for Israel, and a big loss for the Palestinians, of course. So it's interesting to see. We know that water has always been an asset, a target, a tool in wars. Immediately after the occupation, the Israeli government declared the West Bank waters to constitute a military matter under several military orders, which were immediately adopted in June, November, and then again placed in March 71, decision-making in the hands of an Israeli High Planning Council, any decision relating to water. So water was immediately sort of securitized, strategized as a very important asset in terms of Israel's occupation of the land. And of course, this has left the Palestinians under a lot of uncertainty, a lot of insecurity, a lot of control, and inability to access their water rights. Over time, actually, what Israel did was also to shift the focus away from the parties' rights, because the Palestinians have a rightful access to their own groundwater, towards a dominant narrative about the needs of the Israelis, mutual needs. And I think here we can discuss also the importance of water rights in establishing, especially the occupied communities, rightful access to their resources. The only agreement that remains in force today is the Oslo II Accord, and it started in the argument that I make in my paper is that it institutionalized hegemony under the disguise of a peace cooperative process. And actually what happened here is that the difference in water allocations was stark already from the Oslo II Accords. Israel was to receive about 483 million cubic meters per year. This is the bulk of the annual recharge of the mountain aquifer. The Palestinians were just to receive 200 million cubic meters per year. And despite all of the Oslo II new provisions, the military orders issued in 1967 remained in force. Additionally, it made the Oslo process. The Palestinians were forced to submit the blueprints of their proposed water projects to a newly created joint water committee, which was constituted, of course, in appearance equal number of Israelis and Palestinians, but it went through what is described as a veto process on the part of Israel, who was able to, through the Joint Water Committee, to veto Palestinian demands for new water projects. And so this has clearly very much impacted the capacity to expand access to water. It's interesting to see this Joint Water Committee has an Israeli civil administration, which includes 13 subcommittees, including a committee constituted of the Israeli settlers, illegal settlers in the occupied West Bank, who also have a say on how much water the Palestinians can use. I will just finish quickly to say these measures have meant that only 1/3 of the additional volume of water promised to the Palestinians has been released since the Oslo Accord of 1995. And the Israeli also authority made the Palestinians dependent on water purchase from an Israeli company, the Mekorot Water Company, because it's also important to note that following the 1982 purchase, between quote unquote, of the West Bank water supply and infrastructure by this Israeli company, it was granted a license to supply the Jewish settlements as well as the Palestinians, clearly forcing, and I'm quoting here, al-haq, the Palestinians to buy back stolen water. So today, Palestinians control only about 10% of the mountain aquifer. And according to the World Health Organization, the minimum amount for each person is on a daily basis, 100 liters. Israeli settlers have access to 250 liters a day, and Palestinians have in average only 82.4 liters. So there's a stark asymmetry. And here, clearly, despite the presence of a so-called peace process, this water asymmetry has not changed. Again, it's worth mentioning that these settlements are illegal, and B'Tselem has documented how many are, like more than 600,000 settlers, Jewish settlers, illegally implemented between East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the occupied West Bank. And just to finalize my presentation, there's been also a strategy of weaponization by Israel targeting water infrastructures in the occupied West Bank through confiscation and demolition. Just to mention, in 2021, Israel demolished 40 structures. In 2020, 84 of the 849 structures that Israel destroyed in the West Bank were related to water and sanitation. So I will end here, and we have depicted between all of these different cases a very stark, very dark picture of what is happening and the importance of water as a strategic asset, but also as a tool and as impacting also the human insecurity of the populations. I will open with one question now to all of the panelists. Considering all of the discussion we had, the Gaza war, the ecocide that is happening, the genocide, how meaningful is the concept of environmental justice in terms of promoting, rehabilitating historical rights, addressing hegemony, occupation? And in that concept, maybe Fuad also you could add the importance of international water law in correcting those injustices. And please, you can jump in as you wish.
Well, because you introduced me by name, I mean, I will be pleased to start off and say that I think the concept of environmental justice is very important. It's very important from a framing and mobilization of activity, activity which is designed to influence political decision makers, to inform the decisions they have in front of them, and to curtail the space, as it were, for the perpetuation and continuation of environmental harms. But so often is the case, we don't see that. I think any good international lawyer will tell you that law is so often subordinate to power. And there are interests of the community of nations that would put those individual, bilateral, or regional interests ahead of how they view the law and the application of the law, the interpretation of that law. So the environmental harm that has been done to Gaza in the last 5 months, it's very hard to imagine the remediation thereof, given that 60% of all housing has been destroyed, and the amount of rubble on the ground and the expected years it will take just to remove that rubble, and with all the ill effects that come with the destruction impacting the land which they grow food from, seeping into the aquifer which they try to take clean water from or relatively there. So the environmental harm is great, and it's about advocacy, and environmental justice can help push and frame it a little bit in the right direction, but there's still much to be done.
Thank you, Fuad. Elia, you wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you, Marwa. I was recently, I attended a panel here in Geneva, and one of the speakers, it was on the concept of the meaning of international law in the context of what's happening in Gaza. And one of the speakers was Michael Fakhri, who's the UN Special Rapporteur to the on the right to food. And he pointed out something very, very, it would seem very straightforward, at the very least, about what was happening in Gaza at the time, that when the decision was made by the Israeli army in that, I guess now infamous speech in which I believe he's the general, says that we're going to cut off the water, we're going to cut off food, electricity, all of that stuff in the days after October 7th. The question that should have also been asked is, like, how is that even possible? So at the end of the day, it's not easy to, if you think about it, to cut off something that basic on such a large population. But the point, of course, is that it was possible because the Israeli authorities are the ones controlling the flow into Gaza in the first place. And because of that, they have understood, as you have yourself mentioned, whether in the West Bank or whether even in the early days of the Israeli state, that anything related to the environment is a form of weapon, is a potential weapon, is a tool to be used as part of a wider project. And that's why, kind of the other side of that same coin, a major component of Palestinian resistance, including of international solidarity with Palestinian resistance, I'm talking about the international activists who go to the West Bank to resist settler violence against farmers, for example, or to protect olive trees. It has always been a major component of what is usually called the conflict. So for me, it's just two sides of the same coin, really.
Thank you, Elia. Anyone? Muna, Mohammed, do you want to add? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you all. And I think, yeah, just to kind of also further elaborate on these great points made by Fuad and Elia, is that also environmental justice has been inflicted on Palestinians for decades now in all of these fragmented geographies. So if we speak about environmental injustice in Gaza, the fact that it has been undergoing a 17-year siege and total fragmentation and disconnection from its continuation, from its geographical continuity with the rest of Palestine, and the inflicted harm that has been inflicted on Palestinians, not just the direct, let's say, distributive harm of environmental hazards and toxins and all of that by the Israeli occupation, but the actual kind of structural harm that Palestinians have been going through for the past 75 years because of Israel's settler colonial project. So if we put that in context, I think it can move us also beyond environmental justice framing, or whether it's climate justice framing, to go beyond the co-option of like putting it in an institutionalized kind of logic of, oh, let's just make sure it's more distributed more equally. But what is equal in a condition of settler colonialism? And we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond and also mobilize, like Elia was saying, it's a lot about mobilizing and changing the language and the framings that we're using. And we kind of also need to push about, Gaza, the continuation of the situation of the siege on Gaza needs to be halted completely, and also reparations that will include Palestinians' return to their lands. And that, for me, constitutes environmental justice. This is how justice can be achieved, if we kind of also push beyond those limitations and limitations under which we have been working with the international law in mind, or international community in mind. So to push these boundaries, because I think it is really important to expose the reality of this ongoing genocide and this decades-long ethnic cleansing for what it is. And I think this is really important in terms of a justice framework.
Thank you, Mona. I think the concept of environmental justice is really also about looking at the legacies of violence and occupation and colonialism and conflict and dispossession, and providing reparations, as you mentioned, and repairing the injustice. So there's a really introspective, historical, strategic sort of inward and process where we cannot just talk about what is happening. We have to look at the roots of what is happening. And if there's an ecocide, that means a deliberate destruction, devastation of the environment, but also of its people. Mohammad, in terms of Yemen, what do you think, what is the meaning of environmental justice? And possibly how could the situation, we know Yemen is also one of the most dire country in terms of water scarcity. It has gone through a very devastating conflict as well. The population has gone through famine, literally famine. We had like very dark pictures of children being famished in the last few years. What would be an environmental justice approach to Yemen and to restoring human security and water security in Yemen, in your view? What could be done?
Yeah, I've been listening, which is quite interesting, especially the relevance of environmental justice for this region. I think we can feel that in Yemen. If you just open the TV, or just, I think many Yemenis just open the window and look at the rockets going into in both directions and see how affected they are. Of course, Yemen has not been colonized, so only the south of Yemen, which has fewer populations, only I think 15% of the total of Yemen water issues have not been a part of, let's say, these legacies of colonization in Yemen. But Yemen now have gone, as you mentioned, Marwa, through really a war that is not invoked by Yemenis. It's clearly a proxy war between regional powers. It's now in the 8th or going into the 9th year. We are already 2 years in a ceasefire. The situation has so there's no major fighting in Yemen. But still, if you look at how many children have been born in the last 8 years that have probably no future, that have been involved in the war, that will probably not have a future in the next 10 or 15 years because of the stagnation and the nature of the conflict and the lack of interest for the conflict. Internally, if you look at basic human dignity for internally displaced people who really suffer from lack of access, and these internally displaced people are historically we call them the Muhammad machine. Many of them in Yemen are groups that have that are not tribal. They don't have good standing socially in the Yemeni society, and so on. The siege on Taiz and so on. And again, this is a war that I think most Yemenis wonder why it started and why it continues, actually.
Thank you. Yemen is often forgotten. That's why I'm very happy to have you on that panel, Mohammed, as well, because we need to put the focus on Yemen as well. The audience is very much welcome to ask questions as well. I don't see any questions yet, but so I'll move on to my questions. We've agreed now from our discussion that there needs to have ways forward for sustainable decolonization, and that implies decolonizing access to the resources, the land, the people, and repairing those environmental injustices. I started this panel by mentioning the World Water Day, which will be celebrated on Friday, March 22nd, in the context of really water tragedies happening in our part of the world. One of the aspects of one of the key messages of the World Water Day is the need to cooperate on water to balance everyone's water needs and help stabilize the world. That sounds very nice on paper, and we know that's the ideal solution. How can we have these ways forward towards really cooperating? And my paper was about how cooperation is a disguise for hegemony sometimes. How can we have, which ways could we put forward to decolonize really access to water, human security, and as practitioners, analysts, and people involved in such conflicts as well on a personal level, what are your calls to action for our listeners today, and possibly policymakers if they listen? They don't always, some do, but what are the ways we can push and transform institutions, and what can individuals do in their fields? Fuad, you mentioned advocacy. Elia, you mentioned international water law, and Muna, the need to end settler colonialism, and Mohammed, the need to have Yemen on the agenda, keep the focus on Yemen. Activism is a way, but what would you suggest? Is there a need to reconsider the meaning of water security? Is there a need to enforce international water law, international law, etc.? I'm just putting it on the table. Who would like to jump in? Muna?
I'm happy to go. And these are really great questions, really, and very important ones, I think. I think for me, one of the most important thing is to kind of reconceptualize what water security is and what do we actually mean by it. Because I think there has been a lot of fixation, especially by nation states, but also by these transnational governance and global governance institutions, to thinking that water can be transactional. The idea is that we can maybe produce more new water and technology can help save the day. Maybe market-based mechanisms can help us achieve what we want in terms of like providing water. But water is much more than a transactional object. It's about relations, it's about connections to the land, it's about history and memory and futurity. And Mohammed mentioned something really poignant, which is the idea is that what do we envision in terms of a future in our region, in our homelands? How does that future look like? And will it be contingent and really always based on these outside intervention, coming with technological fixes, with ideas of eco-normalization, with the ideas of transactions of water for energy, water for peace, and kind of this conditionality around our relations with needs to be kind of confronted. And I think this is where it starts. It starts about kind of giving back ownership to communities to manage their own resources, to reproduce and reuse and bring to life traditional knowledge that has been there for centuries, and also adapted to address all of the challenges we face today, including climate change, but others, and also instability. But yeah, kind of reconfiguring and rechanging this lens that we have been using for very long that hasn't really produced any significant and meaningful change.
Thank you, Muna. Anyone else? Fuad, Elia, Mohammed?
Happy to jump in for a second. I've always found Obviously, it's normative and ideal, water for peace, and thinking about water as a bridge to cooperation, and it always has that potential. But so often, those who are promoting such aren't often willing to look at the dark side of the other side of the coin. I think, as Elia mentioned, whereas water is often weaponized among other natural resources. And when we look to the international community to actually, and I believe in advocacy, I think it's important to go back and look at some unintended consequences of certain policies. The water situation in Gaza was identified well into the 90s, coming out of Madrid peace process and all the technical work that was done. And USAID and the US government were going to fund and started laying the groundwork for a large-scale desalination plant in Gaza. And in 2003, 2004, they basically withdrew the funding support for it. After all the technical work had been initially prepared, but implementation was about to happen, because 3 Americans passed away in Gaza, and that's tragic. It's awful. But in that moment, they made a political decision that subsequently made Gaza a less livable place. The government wasn't able to provide a basic service, and the prospects of the future might have unfolded into political change in Gaza, which is much worse now for them. And so, had we provided that desalination facility back in 2003, 2004, the landscape politically in Gaza may be completely different, because the government in the West Bank would have been seen as being able to deliver. So can we now put a desalination plant in the Sinai to provide water into Gaza for life support that's beyond the destruction zone that we now see? I think we can. We just need to advocate for people to live up to the commitments of putting water outside the conflict for just human dignity, to be able to call ourselves human beings. Thank you.
Dignity is the word. Thank you, Fuad. Elia, do you want to add to that? We have 3 minutes left. I'd like to give you back the floor, each one, for a final comment, if you wish.
Very briefly, because I don't have that much to add to what was already said. The experience of indigenous resistance in what is currently called the Americas is informative in a very concrete way, not just it's often kind of just turned into a symbolic way or whatever. And there are quite a few Palestinian scholars who have been making those links. It's a much older struggle in many ways, of course, although the organizational capacity of indigenous movements is decades old because of various factors that I won't get into. And so I see lessons there, because there have also been victories. They have gotten land back in multiple cases. They have changed the way the land is stewarded in many cases as well. And so given that in our region right now, we are lacking hopeful stories, not that they don't exist, but we are in desperate need of more of them. I personally look for elsewhere because there's no reason why something that is done in a certain part of the world couldn't be done in a different part of the world, although it would be done differently, of course, but you get my meaning. Just that, other than that, of course, I think it's already been said.
Thank you, Elia. Actually, the concept of environmental justice stems from the indigenous community's resistance in America. So, and it's been starting to be applied everywhere else. Thank you for that. Muna, Mohammed, last comments? Words of wisdom?
Quickly add to what have been mentioned. I absolutely agree. Mobilization and grassroots. I mean, we have to demand from our governments, not the international donors, but our political elites more. We have to demand from them to prioritize water. And because if it is not done, it is the future will be shaped by basin closures, by technology, by international aid, and so on. There are, in Yemen, for example, there are long history of traditional management of water that can be used. There are solutions, and of course, technology is a part of it. With the scale of the issues that we have now, but we need a vision for regional development, for for the water basins that should be done by political elites now.
Thank you, Mohammad. Mona, the floor is yours. The last words.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I think just to kind of echo all of these sentiments, I think definitely the need is to kind of focus on like a future in the region, a future in the basins where we can actually reclaim our water rights and our land rights in a way that also dignifies us, not merely as water users or just, you know, with this the kind of type of transactional interaction, but kind of really reclaim and rebuild and repair our relations with our environment. And that should be kind of the starting point, is to kind of really from the grounds up rather than just from imposed solutions and ideas coming elsewhere, just to kind of really reroute back to water and land relations.
Thank you very much, Mona. Thank you all. We reached the end of our panel. I think we'll end on these words and calls for water justice, but justice also more broadly, human security and dignity for all, and through their resources, but also through their land. And hopefully we'll see an end to the tragedy that is unfolding in our part of the world, whether in Yemen, whether in Gaza, whether in Lebanon, in the West Bank, and everywhere. Thank you all for a very, very interesting, fascinating discussion. And I hope we will have another opportunity together on more optimistic grounds, possibly next time talking about better water sharing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.